Good morning, St. Mark's, and our friends who may be joining us virtually today. We're happy to have Pastor Gordon Simmons with us today, and happy that you've joined in. Our purpose here is that you be both informed and hopefully inspired by being exposed to people in various ministries that may be different from pastoral ministries per se, but are still valid and vital parts of the church's broader ministry in the world in which we live. And that will be especially true today. So we welcome Pastor Gordon Simmons. Gordon and I go back a few years, and it was good to see him. We've already chatted a bit. Discovered that we may have been ordained on the very same day because we are essentially the very same age. So to one of my peers and old friends, welcome to St. Mark's Lutheran Church.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Good to be here with you today.
Gordon, where'd you grow up? You know, what do you want to share with us about you? Just your basic background before we get into particulars about what's up now.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, a long ways from here, and that's where I went to school. I went to Midland Lutheran College in Fremont, Nebraska. But then I came out to Philadelphia Seminary. So that's how I began to get acquainted on the East Coast. Although I went back to Nebraska and served in a couple places, I began my ministry as the director of an inner city youth program in Omaha. There were 6 congregations that were involved in that. And then served as the assistant of a large church in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I was involved in the political realm there too. We formed a group called the Nebraska Lutheran Legislative Caucus. Now, Nebraska is a unique place legislatively because they're the only state that has a unicameral. There are 49 senators, and that's it. So when you're talking to one senator, you're talking to 2% of the vote. Very different from other states that have sometimes hundreds of people that are involved in it. Anyway, then I came back to Philadelphia and for 10 years served as the director of an urban coalition. There were 15 congregations, mostly in racially changing neighborhoods that I worked with. And then I served one of those congregations for 19 years, Reformation Church in Philadelphia, before spending 9 years in Wallingford, which is right outside Chester. So not very far from where we are this morning, really. Actually, I used to bike over here and visit with the pastor in those days sometime because it was close, and Fred was that old friend in urban ministry, Fred Melton. So I retired 6 years ago, and we lived in Dover because our daughter lives there. That's why we moved there. And then a few years ago, I got involved in this legislative program.
Okay, and you were assistant to the bishop for a while there. I think Bishop Hertzlane was
here in Delaware.
Yeah.
Yes. My first year of retirement, I was half-time filling in and working with the churches in Delaware and some of the churches in outside of Baltimore.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for now, 5 or 6 years you've been involved in I'm going to forget the name.
Delaware Lutheran Office for Public Policy. Yeah, it's about 3 or 4 years now.
Okay.
We got this. This is a program that started in the mid-'80s, and St. Mark's Church was very involved in it. One of the pastors from here was in this position for a while, part-time, and then I think a layperson had the position for a while too. And the program continued for about 25 years until about 2012. And then I think for lack of funding, it was discontinued. But after I moved here and found out about what was going on, I went to the bishop. I said, hey, I'm retired. It doesn't need to be a paid position. I can be a volunteer. And so that's how we got it started again.
Okay. Who was the pastor here who was involved? I'm just curious.
I'm sorry, I don't remember. He was the assistant pastor. And so in the mid-'80s. And so he was part-time as the public policy officer for the state.
Chuck Stadler. It was Chuck Stadler, I'm sure.
And part-time as the assistant pastor here.
He's still a member here with his wife.
Okay.
Uh-huh. Okay, so it's evolved a bit,
yes.
or re-evolved, if you will, into what? What's going on now?
Well, we have a policy council that has representatives from various churches across the state, and Jen Sullivan is the representative from St. Mark's and does a fantastic job keeping people alert to what's going on. But we every year establish some priorities for issues that we especially want to follow. But then more generally, I try to get information to churches about what's going on. I write an article for the newsletter that I know you get in your newsletter here, and we alert people to what's happening, and then we have some events. We keep in contact with legislators and will indicate various positions that the Lutheran Church may have that might be relevant to bills that are being considered. Frankly, I see the work primarily as trying to break down the separation between our public lives and our religious lives. Mm-hmm. We have a religion, Christianity, that is very concerned about justice, because we believe this is what God cares about. And so for people to say, as we often do, well, you shouldn't get involved in political stuff or whatever, that leaves out a big part of the world, and this is God's world. So I'm interested in people seeing these connections, and mm-hmm. I understand people may have different opinions about it at times. That's okay, but we're going to try to advocate for certain positions. So let me just tell about the two that we've been working on. Sure. Especially. Sure. One is education, and Delaware has a unique system because so much of I think more than 70% of the costs of public education are funded by the state, as opposed to by local school districts. Mm-hmm. And that's unique. In Pennsylvania, it's a much higher percentage that's provided by the local mm-hmm. thing. So this is an opportunity, obviously, to provide some funding for areas that are lower income, but it doesn't always work out that way either. So we're continuing to work on that. And there has been there was a lawsuit a couple years ago which was finally settled, and the argument was that children that were from low-income schools, a high percentage of low-income population in those schools, were being underfunded in relationship to the need. Mm-hmm. And so there was a settlement about that. That was worked out, and because of that, the governor has put in this year $25 million more for those schools. It will grow to $60 million over the next couple of years. And that was a big victory in a way, and it happened. And it didn't happen through the legislature; it happened through the courts. But now it's being enacted through the legislature.
Gordon, that begs a question for me. We hit the ground in Delaware in 1977. That dates me a bit, but that was the first year when busing was implemented. Mm-hmm. And I believe, as I became aware of it, that as busing issues go, Delaware didn't do too badly at them, but busing is not necessarily an ideal way of making it happen. I don't know what the situation is now relative, but you talk about low income area schools. That was supposed to be altered significantly with the busing program. Question one would be, how's that going?
Well, it hasn't gone very well. I mean, I think as people look back on that now, they feel like it hasn't worked out very well. One of the things that it did was to really eliminate the Wilmington School District, so that everything is kind of pie-shaped. But it has not prevented the segregation by income, and often that means race also.
Sure.
So that one of the things that there's a commission that's working now. Senator Elizabeth Lockman from Wilmington is the chair of it. It's called the Redding Commission. It's named after first black attorney that worked on civil rights in Delaware, and they're working on a bunch of stuff and to provide better resources for low-income schools, regardless of where they are. But I think the feeling is that the system in Wilmington is kind of broken down, and they're trying to make some improvements in that. one of the big issues that this commission's consortium, it's called, is working on is how do you get the best and the experienced teachers to teach in the low-income schools. Mm-hmm. It's more difficult, there's no question about it. And so they're working on that to see if they can. And I think there'll be some legislative proposals about that, probably have to do with funding and other things that may try to increase that.
So before you get into the second thing you were working on that you had mentioned, mm-hmm. It seems to me that a lot of the discussion at the time of busing that went on had to do with housing, that the real problem was housing, mm-hmm. and that was simply too costly to tackle at the time, and so money got spent on gasoline instead, and any number of other expenses that accompany busing. Mm-hmm. That could have destroyed neighborhoods at some level, mm-hmm. That kind of thing. Now here we are at the present moment when there's housing shortages of all kinds, mm-hmm. but particularly affordable housing for lower income people. Is there anything happening either associated with the educational needs or disassociated from it that's being done or contemplated being done with the whole issue of housing?
Well, yes, there is some things. It has to do with the education part of it, but in other areas of housing that the state's working on, they do have aggressive programs to provide support for lower income people, for subsidies for rentals, because that's sometimes people just can't even afford to get a place, and that's being worked on. This is somewhat anecdotal, but I do feel like in the southern part of the state that there is much more of a mix of housing in school districts. I mean, I can tell you where we live in Dover, within 5 minutes of where I live, and I don't live in the city. I have a Dover address, but I really live outside the city. But within 5 minutes of where I live, there are $500,000 homes, there are $300,000 homes, there are farms, there are mobile homes. There are mobile homes that are in pretty bad shape, but all these people live in the same school district. Mm-hmm. And I think that has helped, because I really think that the evidence would indicate, and as I say, some of this piles on racially, but if you just leave that part off and deal only with low income, mm-hmm. the worst thing for a kid is to go to a school where all the other kids are, if they're low income, where all the other kids are low income too. I mean, the kind of motivation that is needed is tough in those schools. There's so many other problems that exist. You know, when I was serving in Philadelphia, and we were in a neighborhood where there were a lot of economic problems. One day, a third grader went into the cloakroom and somehow or another hanged himself and died. Mm. I don't know if it was ever determined if it was intentional or if it was an accident.
Yeah.
But how'd you like to be the teacher of the rest of the kids in that class that day or the rest of the year?
Oh, sure.
Or whatever. I mean, there's so many other distractions going on. And so that's why the emphasis is upon saying we've got to work on low-income schools and provide more resources there.
Well,
and the state is moving in that direction. Whether it'll happen fast enough to cause all the problems or not, I don't know. But
one last thing that's related, I think, and that's broadband and the availability of computers for mm-hmm. some of the lower-income people, right. which has especially been a problem during COVID.
Well, and in Sussex County, it's a big issue. There are areas that just aren't covered by it. Mm-hmm. And so even if somebody gives you computers, it doesn't work. And you've got a lot of Hispanic people people farm mm-hmm. workers and others, that's an issue for them. You know.
Okay. Your second.
Well, now the other issue was the environment.
Okay.
Boy, and I just finished reading Bill Gates' book on how to avoid a climate crisis, which I mean, he says we've got to get to zero emissions by 2050, which That's going to be a big goal. And now we have a goal now in Delaware of 40% renewable energy by 2035. But this is only in producing electricity. It doesn't count cars. Mm-hmm. It doesn't count a whole lot of other things, okay?
Sure.
So if we ever got to 100% renewable energy for electricity, that's not the same as 100% renewable energy, okay? We're clearly moving in that direction. There are some, I mean, people have different opinions about this. I mean, there's some people that think it's all a hoax and nothing's going to happen. And there are other people that feel like we're so far along that nothing you do now is going to stop it anyway.
Exactly, yeah.
But people like Gates are trying to be optimistic and to say there's some things that we've got to do. So there's no question. I mean, we are moving toward more solar and wind energy, particularly right now solar, but the wind will happen too. Mm-hmm. There's a whole debate about nuclear energy. Now, right now, there's a lot of nuclear energy that produces electricity in Delaware. Gates feels like nuclear energy can be a big part of the solution if it's done differently.
Which means?
And well, I mean, they've got to figure out ways of avoiding any catastrophes.
Well, for sure.
And dealing with the waste better. But he thinks it's possible to do that. And in his book, he talks about how, there were predictions of massive starvation that in the 70s and 80s, people were saying by the year 2000, people are going to be massive deaths because of, and then because of new seeds that were developed, mm-hmm. and the production of crops expanded significantly, that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And that's Gates' argument about the nuclear. We just got to find a different way of doing that. And it can be done, he believes. And he's invested billions of dollars himself in experiments about it. So there are other things that are happening environmentally. The state is involved in subsidies for electric cars. They're working on more charging stations. I think that will eventually be a part of a solution. The water, there's big problems of clean water in Delaware.
Well, that's not new.
No, it's not new.
Yeah.
There has been a water trust fund that it looks like it's going to be established. And they're trying to, I think they're going to try to put $50 million a year into that for several years, and then that will produce income over a period of time that can be used on water improvement projects. Mm-hmm. So that's, I should say that Delaware right now is in pretty good shape financially. People wondered about that with the whole COVID thing, because obviously it's with the unemployment, it's reducing the income from the income tax. Mm-hmm. State agencies, like everybody else, and schools have had to pay for masks and sanitation and who knows, all the costs that are involved in that.
Sure. Plexiglass,
I mean, they're just massive, millions and millions of dollars are being spent on this. But Delaware is still solvent, and they don't call it a rainy day fund, but that's basically what it is. Budget Stabilization Fund, it's called, and they put money into that every year, and so right now, even without they're going to get federal money too. So right now, the state is in fairly good condition for that. And
are you aware at all to Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, in terms of their condition?
No, I'm not sure what that is.
I mean, their funding sources and so forth.
Sure what that is.
Because we sit here as kind of an island of sorts.
Yep.
Anyway.
Well, the air quality in Delaware is not good, and some of it is caused by Delawareans, but a lot of it's not. I mean, the winds blow this way, and so that's part of the reason for not using as much coal in our electricity, because these coal burning plants are there, even though they're not in Delaware, we get the remnants of them.
My first parish was in Toledo, Ohio for 5 years, and Toledo was voted one year one of the cleanest air cities in the country, which was hardly believable because of all the industries there. Mm-hmm. But prevailing winds blew all of our smog to
I
Pittsburgh and Philadelphia.
Oh, I
so
see, okay.
can't do anything about that.
Right. So there's a lot of other issues that are coming up before the legislature, and we're going to be looking at more of them in the next few weeks. I mean, the whole gun thing is explosive. You know, people have such strong feelings about that on both sides. So there are some proposals that are aimed at trying to reduce gun violence. One is that are before the legislature this year. One is to make the so-called you can buy a kit now and make your own gun, and it doesn't have a license, doesn't have a
Serial number.
Serial number on it. Now apparently Biden's executive order is trying to change that so that you'd be required to have it licensed, whether in any case. But what effect that will have, what will effect of how in the debate here, I'm not exactly sure. But that's certainly an issue. There's a proposal to require everybody in Delaware that owns a gun to get a license for it, and to have training before they get the license. Whether that will pass or not, I don't know. But I mean, the argument is that's what you have to do for a car, so why shouldn't you have to do it for a gun?
One of the arguments that I've used with myself, and it's at some level a risky one, maybe a silly risky one, but we deal with boundaries all over the place in society. There are certain limits to what we can do or say. So if I came into church one Sunday with a rifle and had a children's sermon entitled, "Who Would Jesus Shoot?" As silly and risky as that may be, it would be patently intolerable to the congregation. I understand that. Yeah. And that's a boundary. So if that's a boundary, what other boundaries can we intelligently set that would mitigate against the incredible numbers of deaths and injuries that occur due to gun violence?
And people don't always think about this, but the bigger problem in regard to gun violence is suicide. There are more suicides than there are murders. And one of the reasons I mean, I guess there's a lot of reasons for the increase of suicides, but one of them is the suicides among women. Women used to, when they wanted to commit suicide, slit their wrists or take pills.
Sure.
Usually those are not fatal, but guns are. And there are more guns around in people's homes, and people are using them, and there's no question that. Now, that doesn't mean that you can easily solve that problem. I understand it. There's a bill that I think is likely to pass, which is going to require anytime somebody buys a gun at a gun store, they have to be given anti-suicide literature. Now, how many suicides that's going to stop, hard to tell, but at least people are trying to say something about it.
Do you know that there's an increase in women using guns to commit suicide? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of the increase in suicide that's occurred. Part of the problem in the Supreme Court decision in, I think, 2007, which was the first Supreme Court decision which linked the Second Amendment to private ownership of guns. I mean, before that, it wasn't clear that this was meant to apply to private ownership, because really what it says in the Constitution is that it has to do with militia.
Yeah.
But the Supreme Court in 2007 said, no, this applies to private ownership of guns. However, and Scalia wrote this decision, he made it very clear, this does not mean that the state cannot put restrictions on gun ownership. And so, most people would assume that if you commit a murder and say it's only second or third degree murder, so you only spend 20 years in jail, when you get out, you're probably not going to be allowed to buy a gun. I think most people accept that there's a restriction that seems logical. We have in Delaware now the so-called red flag law that's been passed, which says that if you have certain mental conditions, you can be declared incompetent as far as owning a gun, and your gun can be taken away from you. Obviously, there's going to be questions of interpretation on that, as to who gets it and who doesn't, But there are people who are very, very sensitive to any kinds of restrictions on guns. I mean, I've heard it said, for example, one of the big problems people argue is, let's say you're a woman and your husband has a gun and he threatens you. So the husband is put out of the house and his gun is taken away. But you're concerned that he's going to get another gun and come back. So you have to have a right to buy a gun that day. You don't want to do 30 days of training, okay? You need a gun that day to protect yourself against your husband. So there are all kinds of people who, have these arguments that say, and people, there are many people who are very concerned about people breaking into their house at night and that they need to have a gun for that reason. I was at a hearing last year. There was a bill that requires, right now there is a requirement. If you have a gun in your house and you have children in your house, you have to have the gun secured. Mm-hmm. But there are many people who don't buy it. And if you go down the legislature, they'll be wearing T-shirts that say, I will not comply. They're not going to do this. And I heard one man testify to say, if he has to have his gun locked when he goes to bed at night, that's not safe for him, because what if someone breaks in? He doesn't have time to unlock that. He said, I've trained my 10-year-old that if somebody should break into the house and have me under gun, the 10-year-old knows where there's another gun. He can go and get the gun and shoot the guy that's an intruder. Now, my feeling is, I don't want my 10-year-old going to bed every night thinking about this. But this is just where we are. And there's people who feel very, very strongly about this on both sides. And I think for the people that want to have more gun control legislation, that the argument that many of the things that are being proposed are likely to have very little effect on the real problems is valid. So it's a tough issue, and it's controversial for people.
I can count on one hand the times that I've been truly frightened in life. It's just not something, fortunately, that I encounter a whole lot. Maybe it's because of the life I live. But we were in upstate New York. I had a flat tire. It was about 10 o'clock at night. It was a rural area. There was no cell phone connection. I tried my darndest to change the tire myself, but it was on a pickup truck, and the tire was underneath, and it just didn't work. And so I ended up having to go to this house, knock on the door at 10 o'clock, and ask if I could use their telephone. And I, honest to goodness, believed, standing on that porch, that I could very easily die. Just for knocking on the door. And this is upstate New York, and they all have guns. So, Gordon, just a bit of a philosophical question. I think it's philosophical. It has all kinds of practical ramifications in this day and age, especially. If you give a litany of the issues, guns, environment, voting rights, and so forth and so on, there can be a justice component to every one of those that we as Christians can address. But at the same time, there can be the appearance, at least, of partisanship in terms of the political aspects or ramifications of these things. So that you could be perfectly capable of being politically neutral and be concerned about justice, but be accused of being politically partisan anyway.
Yes.
And I don't know if there's an easy way to avoid that either.
It's a tough one, and it's a shame what has happened to partisan politics in our country. I really have to say on both sides. I mean, that people have taken sides so strongly about it. The only caveat to this is that the largest political party in the United States right now and in Delaware are the independents, because people are choosing not to affiliate with either political party.
Sure.
And because there's so much that's being spoken of that is just ill-mannered, and I mean it's a shame, for example, during the COVID thing, that this became a political issue of whether you should wear a mask or whether you should quarantine in different situations, or what kind of, I mean, it should never have been a political issue. I have to say, I've sometimes wondered, if President Trump had taken a very hard, the opposite of what he did, taken a very hard line position of saying, you got to wear a mask all the time, would the Democrats have opposed that and said, no, wait a minute, you're restricting our freedom? I hate to say this, but it's possible they would have.
Possible.
Because that's where we are. Once one side takes its position, then the other side's got to be opposed to it. And it's too bad. And what's happening in Washington is that as the political tides change, the laws are going to get rewritten every 4 years or whatever because different people are written. Now in Delaware right now, the Democrats have veto-proof control of both houses. And I suppose Republicans feel like this is true who's ever the minority in the political system feels like they don't have much power. Mm-hmm. And because of the elections last year, it wasn't always the case, but now they have more than 60% of the votes in the House and the Senate, the Democrats do, so that they can pass anything they want without any support from Republicans. And I'm sure this makes Republicans feel like, well, we're left out of the process. I mean, the solution is for Republicans to get more people elected. I mean, if you're a Republican, that's what you'd want to do.
Which is as true nationally as it is
that's true.
Locally.
Yeah. But in Delaware right now, it's a pretty strong Democratic majority. And it's going to be interesting to see this year because there are some controversial things like minimum wage and marijuana, legalizing marijuana, and some of the gun stuff that the Republicans are really opposed to, but they don't have the votes to stop it. So whether some of those things will pass or not, I don't know.
There are, the ELCA has position paper, I forget the official title of all the proclamations that have been made in
social
assemblies,
statements.
social statements in assemblies. Is it your experience that Lutheran people are generally aware even of those or not?
Well, probably not too much. We do try to promote that. I mean, this is why we got involved in education and the environment, because the ELCA has strong social statements about both of those things. Our church teaches that everybody deserves a right for a good education, no matter who they are, and that the state needs to be providing adequate resources for that to happen. Our ELCA statement on the environment is very, very concerned about protecting the environment. I mean, goodness sakes, we believe in creation. We believe that God made this world. So when we mess it up, we're doing something wrong.
Sure.
So, and we have social statements on a variety of topics that relate to issues, and that's part of the role that we have, is to lift those up.
My experience in talking to people has been that we sort of Lutheran Christians we don't like popes in any fashion that are imposing things on us, but that social statements and other positions of the church become an occasion for conversation about important issues is certainly valid for Christian people. One of the things that I just love is the whole notion of synagogue in its biblical sense. There were no sacrifices or worship experiences in synagogues. They were town halls. They were discussion places, and of course they discussed Isaiah and Amos and those things, and not the local news in Syria or something. But the discussion of issues that pertain to the health, spiritual, political, and otherwise of the community is what they did with synagogues. And that we would have that kind of open discussion and knowledgeable discussion, informed discussion about issues in this day and age. I wish for more of that.
Yes, and that's part of the purpose of our organization, I think, is to say we want to lift that up. It's tough because of what we just said about the whole partisanship, because once people stake out their position on a certain thing, then the other people who are opposed to it assume that, well, they're just saying that from a partisan way, when that's not necessarily the case. But you can't be a good Lutheran and ignore the rest of the world. This is what we believe.
Well, and most Lutheran Christians don't know or appreciate that Lutheran social service agencies as a network worldwide is huge.
Absolutely.
and does, efficient as well as effective
Right.
work.
Yes, immigration's a big controversial issue, but the Lutheran Church is involved significantly in the resettlement of refugees and has been
Absolutely.
ever since Germans were brought over after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And through the whole succession of Vietnamese and Laotians and it's now Syrians and Iraqis and Afghans. This is a big part of what we're doing. The World Hunger Appeal, and a former pastor from this church, Fred Melton,
Sure.
Works with the World Hunger Appeal in our synod. But of all the money that's raised nationally by the ELCA, about a third of it is in the World Hunger Appeal. I mean, this is a pretty, not many churches, not many congregations give away a third of everything that they raise. Okay?
Sure.
Now, most of them aren't even close. That's what our national church does because of all the money that's given to the World Hunger Appeal, and that's funds then that support hunger projects all over the world, including in the United States, and also which supports the advocacy work that's done.
Mm-hmm. Because of largely Fred Melton's, Pastor Melton's efforts that continued after he was pastor here, in 2019, I believe, I saw a letter from the National Church that indicated that St. Mark's was one of 100 congregations in the whole ELCA in terms of the amount of money that was raised for hunger. I don't think we've matched that since. But Fred and I have had an interview like this. Mm-hmm. This congregation has a very rich history of involvement, not only the national, but with Lutheran Community Services locally. Mm-hmm. We're about to participate, I hope, in a virtual breakfast that used to be held physically as a fundraiser for Lutheran Community Services, which has food pantries and a rental assistance program, smoking cessation, and you start to think about what tobacco costs these days and how much people could afford food and other things if that were not being spent. So again, the congregation has a history, and I presume that is going to be preserved into the future because it's so much a part of the DNA of St. Mark's.
Before we quit, I want to get in a word about the Lutheran Day at the Capitol.
Gotcha.
Because we did have one a couple years ago and had a really good response. People came to the Capitol. We met at St. Andrews there in Dover, and representatives and senators came and spoke to us. We're going to do it virtually this year, and it's going to be on June 17th, a Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. And so people can register for this. They can register now. What you do is you go to DELutheranPublicPolicy@gmail.com. All small letters, DELutheranPublicPolicy@gmail.com, and you can register. I'll be getting the registrations. I'll respond to it. We're going to be dealing with some environmental issues and probably some other things too. Senator Stephanie Hansen, who's the head of the Senate Environmental Committee, is going to be speaking. We're also going to use this as an opportunity to discuss Bill Gates' book. So we want to, it's not a requirement, but if people can read the book ahead of time, they'll get more out of the discussion. So I want to encourage anybody that's listening today to spread the word to others and sign up. Just send in your registration, and there's no cost or anything. You can participate virtually in this year's Lutheran Day at the Capitol. Excellent, excellent.
Any last minute thoughts otherwise?
Well, it's always good to be at St. Mark's. You folks do some great ministry here, and I'm glad I'm starting my rounds on Sundays now to speak at all the churches, and so I'm just this is my first one this year, and I've gotten a good start. It's been a wonderful reception, so thank you.
Excellent. Nice to have you. We'll be doing this again in the very near future, actually only a week away. We have Pastor Clarence Pettit coming back for the third time. He and I will be discussing racial issues from a purely theological and biblical perspective, unlike our two previous conversations, which was more anecdotal and relational. We both decided that would be hopefully helpful. And then Pastor Jason Churchill will be here from St. Stephen's a week after that. So midweek extras are going to start popping again, and again, we hope that they are informative and inspirational for you. Please let me and or us know. Have a great week. We will catch you next time.